right. So it is my great pleasure to introduce a man who was my first youth pastor that I ever had. This is Mark Oestreicher, who is well known for all of his youth work. He's the guru of youth ministry. He's worked with youth specialties, and just recently is the founder of a group called the Youth Cartel. And it is a really honor and a pleasure to talk with him. He is also author of this book, A Parent's Guide to Social Media, which you will receive a copy of for attending today. And so I just wanted to welcome Mark and thank him for his time for joining us today.
What a blast to be here. I mean, I'm always happy to be with a group of parents, but come on, Frosty, this is one of my first kids, man. I was his junior high pastor.
So the question is, am I to blame for you or you to blame for me? Or a little bit of both?
Probably both, right? That's right.
So just a quick story. One of the things that I did as a junior high is I thought it was really cool that I could pick Mark up. So every time I would see him, I would give him a hug and lift him off the ground.
That is so true.
I'm still a giant dork. But that's not why we're here today.
Oh, man.
That's not why we're here. We're here to talk about social media. So social media has been a big issue here with recent events with Twitter and Facebook. But there's another thing that happened recently, and I'll ask you to just comment about this shortly. Just recently in Italy, a 10-year-old girl died because she took a TikTok challenge where she tried to black out and suffocated herself and died. And I found that shocking, and I feel like more people should know about kids taking TikTok challenges and dying. So, Mark, the first question I have for you is, what are our kids doing online that we have no idea that they're doing, and why is this so important for us to know?
Yeah. I guess I'd answer this in a couple ways that probably they might feel like they're in tension with one another. The first is what kids are doing online is what teenagers have always done, which is work out their identity in relationship with other teenagers. So the leading expert on teenagers and social media, her name is Dana Boyd, and she talks about how teenagers have always had a developmental need to understand themselves and the world, in relationship with other people, and that historically they've done that in these public spaces that were like, if you think of back to our own teenage years, you think of the mall or the park or something like that. And that as simultaneously with the rise of the internet, we also had this interesting thing where those places that used to be accessible to teenagers as a place to hang out together became inaccessible. So in most malls, teenagers aren't allowed to just hang out anymore, right? And public parks even in the same way. And with our shifts in parenting approach, we often don't even just let kids hang out in the neighborhood and ride their bikes to each other's, and that kind of thing. And so Dana Boyd talks about the internet being, instead of a public space, she calls it a networked public. And it is, and what's happening is in a sense the same that has always happened. There is this sense of fear that teenagers are doing all these scary things online. And we'll get to that. There's some it's reasonable to have some fear in some ways, but I think sometimes we blow it up too much, because what most teenagers are doing most of the time online is the same thing that you and I did in those places where we would hang out with people. The vast majority of their online interaction is with other teenagers that they already know. It's with their friendship group. So that would be my first statement. In tension with that, though, is certainly that there are a whole lot of risks that come with this. Now, there were risks that came with the other way that we used to work that stuff out. These are just different risks. And there's no question there is increased psychological risk and even some level of physical risk that goes with the use of social media. When we get an alert that somebody liked a photo on Instagram or something like that, it actually releases a chemical in your brain called dopamine, which is this chemical that actually makes you feel good, and that becomes an addiction. And so it's really common for, I mean, it's not just teenagers, right? I'm so tied to my phone, and I'm sure many of you are too. But it becomes this addictive thing that's very forming for even the brains of teenagers, let alone their understanding of their self and how they compare themselves to others. And so there are lots of risks that come with it too. I don't make nothing. I don't want to dismiss the girl who died in Italy. I mean, that's a tragic story, but I don't want to chalk that up to, ooh, scary internet, right? Teenagers were doing stupid things that harmed them throughout history. We did stupid things. It's amazing I'm alive today when I consider some of the stupid things I did, right? And so I wouldn't say that's really the issue. The bigger risk is more about your kids' relationship with social media and how dependent they become on it or not in forming their identity and sense of self.
I love that analogy of the internet is our mall. Like, that's what we used to do.
Yeah.
Like, that's a really great analogy. And let's be honest, that there's stuff that you can do on social media that's really fun.
Right.
Like we've got pictures of presidential debates with TikTok things on different candidates talking with voice changing, and it's fun. You know?
Yep.
I've got pictures where my face is on Spider-Man and I'm like a movie star. But so it's really fun. So a follow up on that, and I think what you said is really great. We at our house have tried to limit some of this social media and try and limit that to say, get off your phone. You don't need to be on your phone all the time. And now in a COVID world, we're like, okay, you've got to go to school, get on your device. We said, get off your device now, be on your device 8 hours a day so you can learn. And so how would you advise parents as we navigate through those challenges of?
I do think, and this is like no big shock to parents, I don't think, but teenagers absolutely need boundaries. And social media is only one of those spaces. And they actually will flourish more with clear boundaries. Children and teenagers both actually don't do well in the world when they have no boundaries. And so they do need clearly defined boundaries with a sense of freedom inside those boundaries, because it's critical for teenagers to exercise decision-making. They need to make decisions for themselves and have, of course, increasing freedom. So the boundaries need to get wider as they both grow older and as they prove responsible with the decision-making that they've been given. And so when it comes to using our phones and social media and stuff like that, we need to have boundaries. And just saying, and I'm not, making fun of you or something with what you just said, but just saying, get off your phone is not a boundary. The boundary is more like saying you can have access to your phone from between these hours, or you don't have access to it between these hours. Hey, a really critical piece of this is we have to model it for them.
Absolutely.
Teenagers can sniff out, a lack of integrity so quickly, even at a subconscious level. So, for example, in my home, we had a rule that you couldn't ever be on your phone at all during dinner. And it was a priority for us to have dinner together. There's another set of research that talks about how critical that is in kind of a teenager's forming of identity to have that kind of regular time together as a family. But I'm telling you, because I'm as connected to my phone as my kids are. In fact, I'm probably way more into social media than either of my kids, which is kind of a funny situation. They would call me on it. If I ever even looked at my phone during dinner,
Right.
they would call me out because it was a family rule, not just a boundary for the kids. Right.
Right.
Another one in our home is there's a ton of research that talks about how much sleep teenagers need in order for their brains to be healthy. And that hardly any of them get it. They just don't get enough. And one of the new disruptors of sleep is that teenagers sleep with their phones near their bed, and they get woken up by a ding or a buzz during the night. And so it became a rule in our family. I'm old enough now that when my kids, who are now 27 and 23, when they were getting cell phones, I'd say it was about junior high when they got cell phones. Actually, my kids were a little weird on this. They didn't want smartphones at first, which is really weird today. My oldest kid, Riley, was so proud of their old school flip phone that they had that was totally out of date. But we had a rule that that phones don't go next to your bed, that when you go to bed, your phone gets charged somewhere else. And even though neither of my kids are living in my home today, I still follow that rule. So my phone charges in the bathroom because I'm choosing to live by the same boundary that I was holding for them. So we have to model this, and then we have to hold to the boundaries. So yeah, I would say that, and then probably the other thing I would say about it, Dan, is that it's critical that we talk about this stuff, right? That we help, and not in a finger wagging kind of way, but talk about how social media can be a good thing and it can be really detrimental. And then engage your teenager in what are some of the ways that you think maybe some of your friends use social media in a way that's not healthy for them. And I wouldn't get into stories of kids dying from TikTok challenges as much as I would that dependence, obsession with getting likes and friend requests and that kind of thing, which that's the real seduction of the social media. I guess the other big seduction would be comparing what you know about yourself to what you don't know about someone else, because we always portray a certain image of ourselves on our social media. And so they see their friends, and not only their friends, but YouTube stars and everything else portraying a certain image, but it's not real. And so to talk with our kids about that so that they can learn to discern that a little bit better is really, really critical.
Absolutely. No, and I think that's so important. And I think it's important that for me as a parent, it's been a process. Like perfection, there is no perfection. It's a process. And we've learned the same rule of no phones in the bedroom. And if you need to be on a device in your room, the door is open if you're in class or something.
We actually, that was a rule in our house, not just about phones. In fact, we didn't have a no phones in your room. We had no phones in your room at bedtime, but we did have you can't be on your computer on the internet in your room with the door closed rule, which I think is a really healthy rule. Yep. And also, if there was an exception, if they were, doing online school, which my kids never had to do, but if they were, maybe if my kids the equivalent might have been working on a class project. It was just that we all agreed that that's what's happening and it's for this amount of time.
Right. And another one, no downloading apps. If you want to download an app, ask us. Ask me, just ask and we'll talk about it. And so I think, and those are all things that I've learned going through the process of being a parent. And I think what you said about having a discussion is really important, of saying, so you want this app. Why do you want that? What's the point of you having that?
Yeah. And to be clear, it's an ongoing discussion, not a one-time discussion.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. So you mentioned something else about YouTube, and that has become just something amazing. So the question that I have for you is, we hear about influencers, in the YouTube influencers. Can you first tell people what an influencer is and how you define that, and why they're such an important thing for us as parents to be aware of in the midst of
what a weird thing in our culture that there are people who make a really good living only by being an internet influencer, right? It's kind of a strange thing. I was watching an episode of Shark Tank yesterday, and one of the guys pitching their whole reason for why their product that they were trying to get an investment in was worth so much money was because he was such a massive social media influencer of some sort. Right. Yeah, an influencer is basically somebody who amasses somehow a really large following and then leverages that following to get people to buy things. They're a marketer, really, but they're usually independent marketers. And so, somebody like the Kardashian girls, they're huge influencers. They have other businesses too, but they would be an example. They would get free products and often even paid by companies to either wear their clothes or say good things about a product. And because the influencer is perceived to be somebody who really has it together and has this amazing life that the just common teenager really aspires to have, a life of luxury and a life of partying and all kinds of friends and lots of wealth and all that kinds of stuff, then the natural assumption is I would want to have or buy the things that they have or make the choices that they have. So yeah, it's a huge issue that we need to be aware of. I mean, certainly one of the conversations you could have with your kids is what influences are they aware of? And what do you think those influencers stand for? Like, what are the values that are important to them? And do those line up with who you want to be?
Right. And I think it's important that we're having those discussions, like you said, with our kids about who is it that you're watching. You should know who your kids' favorite YouTube stars are.
Yeah.
And so you should watch those YouTube videos with them. Like you should be interactive. That's what they're doing. And so,
hey, I'll tell you a little thing here. We had a rule in our house too, that I was always supposed to have the passwords to my kids' accounts. That was just our rule. And that I was allowed to periodically go look at what they've been doing. Now, they could create another account that I didn't know about, I suppose. And some kids would certainly do that. But I don't know that my kids did. They may have. But what I would do is I would occasionally log into their Facebook accounts, and this wasn't secret. I mean, it was secret in that I didn't tell them I'm going to do this tomorrow at 4 p.m., but they knew in theory that I might do this. Right. And so I'd say every 3 or 6 months, I would peek and I would look particularly at the stuff that's not public. Right. So like, what kind of messages are taking place? And if I saw some stuff in there that was troubling, I would just go ask him about it, right? And start a conversation about it. There were times when each of my kids lost their computer privileges or online privileges for a short amount of time because I found stuff that I thought was not who we are as a family, right? So yeah, I think I stopped that practice when each of my kids turned about 17 years old. Maybe it was 16, something like that. But prior to that, I wanted to be aware. So I also would look at their internet browser history from time to time to see, what websites were they going on to. I could look at what YouTube videos they were looking at and everything too. It's not about creating a police state. It's more about being aware of what's going on.
Right. And I think there's a fine line between allowing our kids to have autonomy and growing more independent and this right to have everything be private.
Yeah. Right.
And 12-year-olds don't have a right to complete privacy.
Exactly.
That we have to monitor them just like we monitor their grades and just like we monitor that. And I think parents are scared. They think, I don't want to invade their privacy. I don't want to be, and maybe they're afraid of what they're going to find, and they would just rather not find what's there.
Right.
But as parents, we should feel empowered to go and say, every 3 months, I'm going to look at your phone, or I reserve the right to be able to see what websites you're going on.
Right.
And I think that's incredibly important. So that's great. And so what advice, you've given a lot here. Is there anything else you would tell a parent who's helping their kids navigate through online issues?
I mean, I have said probably the advice already. I'd probably say the two most important pieces of advice are model what you are proposing for your kids. Because if you say these are the rules for you, but I'm not going to follow the same rules at all. Like if you say you can't have your phone, you can't respond to something on your phone at dinner, but you spend your time looking at your phone all the time, then your rule isn't going to sink in, right? So model what you are hoping for, and then continue to engage in dialogue about this stuff. It's critical for teenagers to verbalize what they believe. It's a massive part of their faith development and the formation of their beliefs is for them to actually talk about it. So don't go silent on this stuff. Don't just create rules and hold to the rules, but then not engage with them. Now, for some of you, you might be thinking, but man, my teenager won't talk to me already. And I realize there can be a challenge there. For those of you with younger kids, a huge priority as you move into the teenage years with your kids is figuring out how to maintain dialogue, right? Creating an opportunity where you will continue to have opportunities to talk about stuff. Maybe that requires some specific changes in your schedule. Maybe there's a trip that you go on with your kid, just the two of you. So there's long extended opportunities for dialogue, or maybe there's a once a month date night or something like that, just the two of you. And so set up ways that you can continue to have a healthy relationship where you can enter into regular natural dialogue that doesn't feel like it's punitive or disciplinary.
Right. And I think it's important there too that we pick our battles too.
Yeah, of course. Absolutely.
Just because the YouTuber annoys me doesn't mean that I should necessarily fight. Just because they're annoying doesn't mean that I should fight them. That's probably one. Fight the battle a different day. And in fact,
I'll say one more little small thing. Kids they're still, this is very misunderstood by people. Kids are still not legally allowed to have pretty much all the social media accounts until they're 13. Yet a lot of parents allow their kids and even help their kids get around that legality prior to that age. And it's just not healthy. I would say just don't allow it. Just like, we're not going to do it. Once you turn 13, then we'll talk about it.
Right. And I think it's, to lead into the next question, every family is going to be different.
Right.
like what works for your family is not going to necessarily be my family or anyone else's family. And so it's important. And the same thing, like the rules for one child might be different, and that we allow freedoms as freedom is earned. And so how do you suggest that a parent who's got a kid on social media, how would you suggest that they start that conversation about those boundaries and set those in line? And what would you say to them about that?
Well, that conversation is always going to go better if it's a conversation about what we as a family will do, not just what you will be required to do as a kid. So maybe the first conversation isn't about the boundaries. Maybe the first conversation is about, I wouldn't use these terms with a 13-year-old, but about the role of social media in our lives, right? So just to understand, what is it that we like about this? Why do we want it? What's it useful for? What are some of the risks? And maybe not rush right to boundaries in that first conversation. And then maybe another time you come back and start saying, okay, given the fact that there's good stuff about this and some risks involved. Just like other things, there's great stuff about food, and there's also lots of risks involved with food, right? Or whatever it is. There's great thing about air travel, and there's risks involved, right? So, I mean, so what boundaries might we put in place to protect ourselves? Maybe a good example that would be on the mind of a lot of teenagers is driving a car, right? Obviously, driving cars is a wonderful thing that most of us, unless you're Amish, want to do, right? And teenagers, for the most part, really aspire to the mobility and freedom that gives them. And yet they inherently know there are risks involved, and that's why we have laws. The laws are not to squelch our freedom. The laws are to make it safe for us. And in the same way, then, to say, so how might we draw some parallels to using TikTok or Snapchat or whatever it is, and to say, there's good stuff about this. What is it that we like about it? Now, what are some of the boundaries that we think would keep us all safe? And start to build some of those together. If you set it up like as a conversation like that, then when you're making contributions to it, it's not just you saying, these are the rules, right?
Right. And I think it's important for us to kind of meet them where they're at too. You know, like we'll play Among Us as a family. We'll play games with them and say, that is fun. And it is a time that we can share, put a relational investment into that it's not just everything's bad. And I think the problem is so much of it is we have the conversations when we have to, rather than all the time. And so we sit and we have the social media conversation is always negative. It's never, there's never anything that's positive.
Yeah.
And so
it ends up being reactive. Right.
So I say, let's talk about your Snapchat account. And my kids are like, oh, here we go. It's like, it's another lecture. And we need to build in a relational element to that, to say,
yes,
no, like, I get it. It seems a lot of fun. That's a lot of fun it's only fun when you're actually the imposter. That's right. You want to be the imposter, not the crewman. That's terrible. But connecting where they're at so we can talk to them where they're at. And I think that's so important.
Yes.
So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make a point for you.
No, it's great.
We're wrapping up. I appreciate everything about that. I think it's just really important. And to parents, you don't have to have all these rules, but it's just important that we're talking with our kids and that they do know the risks and that they do understand that, because when we talk about influencers, there's people that are trying to influence our kids, and they are doing that. And we need to be just as a prominent voice of influencing our kids. We're the parents that God gave to these kids. So let's influence them in the ways that we need to go.
Yes.
So,
amen.
So it was so wonderful, Mark. I really appreciate the conversation. So I appreciate it. And again, is there something that you want to share, a website that you want to share, resources? This is your time.
I guess maybe the only thing I'll mention is that book that you guys are going to read is one in a set of 5 books that all kind of look like the same thing. They all start with A Parent's Guide to, and then there's Understanding Teenage Guys. There's A Parent's Guide to Understanding Teenage Girls. There's a Parent's Guide to Understanding Teenage Brains. There's the social media one, and there's Sex and Dating. So they're all worth looking at. You can find them all on Amazon. Yep.
Absolutely. So thank you so much, Mark, for your time. I appreciate it. And it was wonderful. So
blessings on you all.